The river locked itself in ice with a sound like a rifle crack. And in that instant Eliza Moreland knew someone's life was about to be taken, if not her body. Then whatever fragile future she had left. She stood at the edge of Granger's trading post porch. 30 years old and already worn thin by the frontier. The cold gnawing through her wool shawl as lantern light flickered against the frozen water below. The river was no gentle thing this far north. It twisted through black spruce and alder, carrying logs, secrets, and sometimes bodies when the thaw came too fast. Tonight it reflected the yellow glow of the post like a watching eye. Men's voices rose behind her sharp, careless, bargaining tones that made her spine stiffen even before she heard her name. "She's still got good years in her," someone said. "Strong enough." Eliza closed her eyes for half a breath. She had heard that voice before. Heard it when her parents were still alive. When she was still a girl and the world had not yet taught her how cheaply a woman could be measured. She turned slowly, inside the trading post. The air smelled of wet fur, kerosene, and boiled coffee. Snow melted off boots and pooled on the warped floorboards. 3 men stood near the counter. One laughed, one leaned with his elbows planted wide, and one, her Uncle Silas, held his hat in both hands like he was praying. Silas did not look at her. "She don't talk much," he said. "Keeps to herself. No trouble." Eliza felt the old heat rise in her chest. No trouble. As if trouble were something she had chosen. Why now? Another man asked. "She ain't a child." "She's alone," Silas replied. "And I'm done feedin' mouths I can't use." There it was, clean. Final doubt Eliza had known this night would come. Ever since the spring flood took her parents, dragged their wagon into the river like a toy, Silas had kept her close. Not out of kindness, but calculation. She cooked. She cleaned. She worked his land until her hands split and bled. And when she turned 18, the looks began. The measuring. The waiting. Still, knowing something would happen did not soften the moment it arrived. Her gaze slid past the men at the counter and stopped on the fourth figure standing near the stacked barrels by the wall. He hadn't spoken. Hadn't laughed. Hadn't leaned in. He stood apart, half swallowed by shadow, his coat old but clean, his hat brim low. His boots were worn at the toes, whitened by salt and frost. His hands large, rough, scarred, rested loosely at his sides as if he were unsure what to do with them. He was watching her, not hungrily, not eagerly. Carefully. The way a man watched a skittish horse, afraid the wrong movement might spook it. What about him? Eliza asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Silas flinched. "You ain't part of this talk." "I am if it's my life you're selling." The room went quiet. The man in shadow shifted his weight. Lantern light caught his face, lined, younger than she expected, eyes dark and guarded. He looked like someone who had learned early not to waste words. Silas cleared his throat. "This here is Jonah Pike." Jonah's gaze never left Eliza. "He's got land upriver," Silas went on. "Not much, but enough for 2. Jonah Pike finally spoke. His voice was low, unused, roughened like wood left too long in weather. "How much?" Silas named a price. Eliza felt it like a blow, not because it was high, but because it wasn't. She was worth less than a mule, less than a good rifle. Jonah did not haggle. He reached into his coat, counted out coins one by one, and placed them on the counter with deliberate care. When he was done, he nodded once. "I'll need a preacher," he said. The ride north began before dawn. They were married in the back room of the post, with a preacher who smelled of whiskey and ink-stained fingers that shook as he read from a ledger pressed into service as a Bible. Eliza stood stiff in a borrowed dress that hung wrong on her shoulders, its fabric heavy with other women's sorrow. Jonah stood beside her, hands clasped, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the wall. When it was done, Silas kissed her cheek like he'd done her a favor. Eliza did not look back. The wagon creaked as it rolled along the forest road, wheels biting into frozen ruts. Pines crowded close, their branches sagging under new snow. The world smelled of sap and cold iron. An owl called somewhere. Deep in the dark, Jonah drove without speaking. Eliza sat rigid, every muscle braced, her thoughts circling the same dread she had carried for years. She had been told what would happen next, what a husband was owed, what a wife endured. She watched Jonah from the corner of her eye. His face was set, unreadable. His hands held the reins loosely, as if even the horses were something he did not wish to command too harshly. Hours passed. At last, the trees opened into a narrow valley. A crooked farmhouse crouched near a frozen creek, smoke curling thinly from the chimney. A barn leaned to one side, patched and repatched. This was no grand homestead. This was survival, barely stitched together. Inside, the house was clean but spare. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove ticking as it cooled. One narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Jonah set down their bag. Eliza's pulse roared in her ears. Without a word, Jonah crossed the room, took a folded blanket from a shelf, and laid it carefully on the floor near the stove. "You can sleep here," he said. She stared at him, suspicion burning hotter than fear. "Why?" He hesitated, as if weighing every word. "Because you didn't choose this." The silence stretched. "I won't touch you," he added. "Not unless you ask." Then he turned away, blew out the lamp, and lay fully clothed on the bed. In the dark, Eliza lay awake, listening to the wind comb the trees and the ice shifting in the creek. Her life had been traded like goods across a counter, but for the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not safety, but possibility, and that frightened her more than anything else. Winter did not loosen its grip after that first night. It settled in deeper, tightening around the valley until the world narrowed to white mornings, iron-cold evenings, and the steady rhythm of survival. Eliza learned the shape of Jonah's days without being told. He rose before light, moved quietly, split wood until his breath smoked like a train, fed the animals with careful hands. He spoke only when words were necessary. Not from coldness, she saw that now, but from a habit formed somewhere, long before her. They lived like two people sharing a truce rather than a marriage. Eliza kept to the house at first, scrubbing floors already clean, cooking meals Jonah thanked her for with a nod. He never watched her the way men in town had, never stood too close, never touched her by accident or design. At night, she laid her blanket on the floor near the stove, listening to the crackle of fire and the steady, distant breathing from the bed. It was unsettling. Kindness, when you are prepared for cruelty, feels like a trap. On the 4th day, Jonah placed a pair of gloves beside her plate at breakfast. Thick leather, patched but sturdy. "For the creek," he said. "Ice cuts." That was all. She wore them anyway. The work was harder than Silas's land, but cleaner somehow. Jonah's fields were small, tucked between pine stands and rock, but every fence post was straight, every tool cared for. He did not rush the land. He listened to it. Eliza found herself doing the same. At night, when the wind howled through the trees and shook the shutters, memories came uninvited. The river swallowing her parents' wagon, Silas's voice turning sharp when she grew too tired to work, the weight of eyes measuring her worth. Once, she woke gasping, heart hammering, her blanket twisted tight in her fists. Jonah was sitting on the edge of the bed, boots on, coat draped around his shoulders. "You were shouting," he said quietly. She swallowed. "I'm fine." He nodded, accepting the lie without comment, and returned to the bed. But he left the lamp burning low until dawn. Weeks passed. The snow deepened. The creek froze solid. And Eliza realized something that unsettled her even more than Jonah's restraint. She trusted him, not fully, not foolishly, but enough to let her shoulders ease, enough to sleep without one eye open, enough to speak sometimes when the silence grew too heavy. One evening, as she kneaded bread at the table, she said, "You could have taken the money and left me at the post." Jonah looked up from mending a harness. "I know. Why didn't you?" His needle paused. "Because they would have sold you again." The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any sermon. She thought of Silas then, of his hands counting coins, of his face turned away. "Will he come looking for me?" she asked. Jonah shook his head. "Silas Moreland doesn't chase what he's already spent." That winter, Jonah taught her the land. How to read the sky through the trees. How to hear when ice was safe and when it would lie. How to tell the difference between hunger and fatigue. Eliza taught him things too, how to stretch a meal. How to read the few books he owned aloud when the evenings grew long. She discovered Jonah could read well, but slowly, like someone who had once been told he shouldn't bother. They did not speak of marriage, not of what it meant or what it might become. They lived side by side, building something unspoken and fragile. Until the day Eliza went to town alone. She needed salt and lamp oil. Jonah hitched the wagon, handed her the reins, and said, "I'll trust you with the horse." It felt like more than a simple statement. Granger's trading post looked the same, lantern swinging, men leaning, the river grinding ice beneath the boards. When Eliza stepped inside, conversation faltered. Heads turned. Granger himself blinked. "Didn't expect to see you back." "I live upriver now," she said evenly, "with Pike." She nodded. Granger studied her face as if searching for bruises that weren't there. "You look well." "I am." She gathered her supplies quickly, but as she turned to leave, a familiar voice slid through the room. "Eliza?" Silas stood near the counter, thinner than she remembered, his eyes sharpening when they met hers. Surprise gave way to calculation. "So it's true," he said. "You stayed." She held his gaze. "I did." He snorted. "Give it time." Something in her shifted then. A quiet line drawn. "Give yourself time," she replied, "to find another way to live." Silas laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You always were ungrateful." She walked out before he could say more. The ride home felt longer. The trees closed in. The river muttered beneath its ice. When she told Jonah what had happened, he listened without interruption. "He won't come," Jonah said when she finished. "But if he does, he won't be welcome." She believed him. Spring crept in slowly, the thaw cautious after such a hard winter. The creek cracked and groaned, then finally ran free. Eliza stood at its edge one morning, watching ice drift past, and felt something loosen inside her. She was no longer waiting to be taken. One night, as rain tapped gently against the roof, Jonah said, "You don't have to stay." The words startled her. "You could leave," he went on, "when the road's clear. I wouldn't stop you." Eliza studied him in the low light. His face was open, unguarded in a way she had not seen before. Offering freedom, not obligation. "And would you want me to?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. No. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, closer than she had ever been. Not touching. "Just near. I'm not going anywhere," she said. Jonah let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Outside. The river flowed on, no longer frozen, no longer raging, just moving forward, carrying what had been and what would come next. The thaw did not come gently. It arrived in the night with a sound like tearing cloth, the river swelling and grinding against its banks as if it remembered what it had taken before and wanted more. Eliza woke to that sound, heart already racing. the memory of rushing water so sharp it tasted metallic in her mouth. Jonah was awake too. They stood together at the window, watching the creek climb its edges, ice breaking free in slabs that spun and vanished downstream. Moonlight flashed on the water like knives. "It'll crest by morning," Jonah said. "If it holds the banks. If it doesn't?" He did not answer right away. "Then we move what we can. And we pray." They worked without panic. Jonah hitched the horses and led them to higher ground. Eliza hauled sacks of grain, lifted tools, stacked what mattered most onto the wagon. The cold soaked her skirts, numbed her fingers. But she didn't stop. She refused to lose another life to water by dawn. The creek had spilled wide and brown, licking the edge of the yard but stopping just short of the house. They stood together in the gray light, mud-splattered and shaking, watching the flood slow and begin to fall back into itself. When it was over, Jonah sagged against the fence, exhaustion finally claiming him. Eliza surprised herself by reaching out, steadying him with a hand on his arm. "Sit," she said, "before you fall." He obeyed without comment. Something changed after that night. Not suddenly, not with grand words, but in the small, undeniable ways that marked trust becoming something deeper. Jonah no longer stopped himself from brushing past her in the narrow kitchen. Eliza no longer flinched at the sound of his boots behind her. They shared the table more often, lingered over meals, spoke of ordinary things, weather, planting, repairs, as if those words were stitching them together. One evening, as Jonah sharpened a blade and Eliza patched a tear in his shirt, she asked, "Why me?" He looked up. "What do you mean?" "You could have bought land, tools, livestock." She met his eyes. "Instead you bought trouble." A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. "I didn't buy you. I bought time." "For what?" "For you to decide who you were going to be." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as something fixed. Not as something owned. Spring came fully then, green and insistent. The valley filled with sound birds returning, water running free, the creak of thawed earth. Eliza worked beside Jonah in the fields, planting carefully, learning the patience of waiting for things to grow. It was on one of those days that Silas returned. Eliza saw him first, a figure moving along the road, his walk familiar even after all this time. Her stomach knotted, old instincts flaring. She did not run. Jonah noticed her stillness and followed her gaze. Silas stopped at the fence, hands raised in a mockery of peace. He looked older, leaner, his coat shiny with wear. His eyes flicked from Eliza to Jonah, measuring. "So this is where you landed," he said. "Didn't expect you to last." Eliza stepped forward. "What do you want?" Silas shrugged. "Word travels. Folks say you're doing well. Thought maybe you'd remember family." Jonah said nothing, but his presence at her side was solid, grounding. "You sold me," Eliza said. "You spent the money." Silas's smile thinned. "I gave you a chance." She laughed, then a short, incredulous sound. "You gave me away." Silas's gaze hardened. "Careful, girl." Jonah moved then, not threatening, just firm. "You're not welcome here." Silas studied him, eyes narrowing. "You the farmer?" Jonah nodded once. Silas spat into the dirt. "Thought you'd be more." "Impressive." Eliza felt heat rise in her chest. "Leave." For a moment, she thought Silas might refuse, might test the line. Then his shoulders slumped and he stepped back. "You always were stubborn," he muttered. "Don't come running when this falls apart." He turned and walked away. Eliza stood shaking long after he disappeared down the road. Jonah did not speak. He waited until her breath slowed, until the tremor left her hands. "You didn't owe him anything," he said quietly. I know. But knowing did not erase the ache. That night, Eliza dreamed of the river again, but this time, she stood on the bank and watched it pass without pulling her under. Summer settled warm and steady. Crops pushed through the soil. The house filled with light. Jonah laughed once, an unexpected sound that startled them both, and Eliza found herself smiling for hours afterward. They began sharing the bed on the coldest nights. Fully clothed, backs turned, but close enough to feel warmth. It was not a question. It was simply practical. One night, Jonah spoke into the dark. "If you ever change your mind about staying, I'll help you go." Eliza turned toward him. "Why are you so afraid of taking?" "Because I know what it costs." She reached out then, tentative, her fingers brushing his sleeve. He froze, not pulling away, not moving closer. "I'm not something to be taken," she said softly. "And neither are you." The words settled between them, heavy and true. The next morning, Granger arrived. Eliza recognized his wagon before Jonah did. Her pulse quickened, but this time it was curiosity, not fear. Granger stepped down, hat in hand, eyes sweeping the land. "Didn't believe it till I saw it," he said. "You've made something here." Jonah nodded. "We're trying." Granger cleared his throat. "I wanted to say, what happened back then? It wasn't right." Eliza studied him. "No, it wasn't." "I won't pretend I can change it," Granger said. "But I can say this: if you ever need anything, supplies, work, word carried." He glanced between them. "You're not alone anymore." After he left, Eliza felt the weight of the past shift, just slightly. That night, she lay awake, listening to Jonah's breathing, the steady presence she had come to rely on. She thought of the girl she had been sold, silent, braced for harm. She turned toward him. "Jonah?" "Yes. What if we stop pretending this is just survival?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, carefully, he reached for her hand. "I was hoping you'd say that." Eliza's heart thudded. Not with fear, but with something fierce and alive. Outside, the river moved on, no longer a threat, no longer a memory that owned her, just water flowing forward. As she finally allowed herself to do the same, morning came softly, as if the valley itself understood that something delicate was unfolding. Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and damp earth drifting through the open window. The creek ran clear now, singing instead of roaring. Sunlight slanted across the floor, catching dust motes and turning them gold. For a moment, she lay still, listening to Jonah move about the kitchen, his steps unhurried, familiar. Last night had not been marked by urgency or fear. There had been no sudden crossing, no claiming. Just two people acknowledging what had already been growing between them quietly, deliberately, with the same care they gave the land. She rose and joined him at the table. Jonah slid a cup toward her without a word. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Not dramatic, not proclaimed, but different all the same. They worked side by side with an ease that felt earned, sharing glances, small smiles, moments of unspoken understanding. When Jonah reached for her now, it was with question in his eyes. And when Eliza leaned into his touch, it was with certainty. They chose each other every day. Summer deepened, bringing long evenings and warm nights. The farm flourished in ways Eliza had not dared imagine. Crops stood tall. The animals grew sleek. Neighbors' loggers passing through, a widow from upriver, a man nursing an old injury stopped by more often, finding in the Pike farm a place that felt steady. One afternoon, Granger returned, this time with news rather than apologies. "They caught Silas," he said, standing by the fence, hat shading his eyes. "Trying to sell land that wasn't his, again." Eliza felt the old knot tighten, then loosen. "What happens now?" she asked, Jail, most likely. Or he'll run. Men like him usually do. Eliza watched the creek as she answered. That's his road. Jonah's hand found hers, solid, present. Silas never came back. The knowledge settled gently, like a door closing without a slam. Eliza mourned what should have been a family, protection, honesty, but she did not mourn the man himself. She had already buried him in the place where false ties went to rest. As summer edged toward fall. Jonah did something that surprised them both. He talked, not just in necessary words, but in pieces of himself long kept quiet. He spoke of his childhood, of the years when his silence had been mistaken for stupidity, when speaking up only earned pain. Of the fire that took his parents and left him with land no one else wanted, and a voice he learned to keep guarded. I thought if I stayed quiet, I couldn't hurt anyone, he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sky bruise into purple and gold. Didn't realize I was hurting myself. Eliza rested her head against his shoulder. You're not quiet anymore. He smiled, small and real. No, I'm not. The first frost came early. One morning, Eliza stepped outside to find the world edged in silver. Her breath rose in soft clouds, and for the first time, winter did not feel like a threat. That night, Jonah reached for her fully, no hesitation, no doubt. They moved together slowly, with reverence, the way one approaches something precious. It was not the night the world had warned her about years ago. There was no taking, no fear. Only trust, built plank by plank, now strong enough to stand on. Afterward, Eliza lay awake, listening to Jonah sleep beside her, and realized the truth. The wedding night had not changed everything. This had. Time, choice, respect. Winter returned, but it found them prepared. The house was warmer, fuller. Laughter came easier. Stories were told by lamplight. When storms pressed in, they pressed back together. In the spring, Jonah asked her simply, without ceremony, if she wanted to make the farm a place others could pass through safely. A stopping point, he said, for people with nowhere else to go. Eliza thought of the girl she had been, standing on Granger's porch, measured and sold. She thought of the kindness that had saved her when she least trusted it. Yes, she said. Let's do that. They repaired the old barn, set aside space, offered food and work in equal measure. Word spread quietly, the way good things do. No signs, no announcements. Just a reputation for fairness. One evening, as Eliza watched the sunset stain the creek red gold, Jonah came to stand beside her. I never asked you, he said, about your parents. She took a breath. They loved the river. Trusted it too much. He nodded. I'm glad it didn't take you. She smiled. So am I. Years later, when travelers asked how they came to be together, Eliza would only say, I was sold once, but I was never owned. And Jonah would add, some things grow best when you give them room. The river kept flowing. The land kept breathing. And in a valley once shaped by loss, 2 quiet lives became proof that the Old West was not only built on violence and greed, but also on the rare, stubborn choice to do better.